Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I'm Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here, and it is my joy on the eve of Indigenous Peoples Day to welcome the Reverend Dr. Bradley Hauff. He is the Indigenous Missioner for the Episcopal Church, which makes him part of the presiding bishop's staff. Brad, we're so grateful to have you with us and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, everyone. I want to greet all of you in the Lakota words, Haumatakiepi. Haumatakiepi. That means hello, relatives. Indigenous people see all people and all of creation as related to each other. We don't see a dichotomy of relatives and non-relatives. We embrace all of creation. So Haumatakiepi, hello, relatives. And good morning in Lakota, Ihaniwashte. Ihaniwashte. Good morning to you. I am enrolled in the Oglala Sioux tribe of South Dakota, so my people are Lakota. And Oglala is the specific tribe. Oglala is a word that means the scattered people. The scattered people. Not the scatterbrained people. Sometimes that applies to me on occasion, depending on what kind of a day I'm having. But I'm enrolled with that tribe, as were both of my parents, and raised in the Episcopal Church. I was appointed to this position in 2017 by Presiding Bishop Michael Curry. Before that, I spent 27 years in congregational ministries throughout Tech. It is a joy to be with you. I make it to New York City, or at least I did before the pandemic, quite a bit, as my office technically is at 815 2nd Avenue, just around the corner and down the street from St. Bart's. But I'm a telecommuter, and I work from and live in my home here in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area of Minnesota. But I'm originally from South Dakota. My presentation is a slideshow, and it is the framework for a new video that my office is producing. We received a Constable Fund grant for that. So that should be finished, we hope, by the end of July of next year. So in the meantime, this is what we have, and I can share it with you. The title of it is, It Ain't Easy Being Native, Indigenous People, Christianity, and the Episcopal Church. I hope you can all see it. How does that look? Thumbs up I'm getting from Peter, thank you. At the top of this slide, you can see that's a flag is what it is. And that's the flag of the Oglala Sioux tribe, my tribe. It has a circle in the middle of it. A circle is the most sacred symbol for Indigenous people. It signifies relationship, as I indicated, as well as eternity and unity. Very important concepts to all Indigenous people across tribes. And the teepees that comprise the circle represent the geographical districts of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is my reservation. And beneath that is a picture of a papal bull or a papal decree. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. As you can see at the bottom of the decree, there's a seal that's hanging there. And the name for that seal is bulla. It's a bulla, and that's where we get bull from, and papal bull. What I'd like to do is I'd like to start out with a prayer. It's called the Gathering Prayer. This is prayed by Indigenous Episcopalians quite commonly when we gather and worship. It was written by Indigenous people and is taken from a disciples' prayer book, which was issued out of my office prior to my arrival around the year 2000, 2001, I believe. So I'd like to pray it as we start off. Creator, we give you thanks for all you are and all you bring to us for our visit within your creation. In Jesus, you place the gospel in the center of this sacred circle through which all of creation is related. You show us the way to live a generous and compassionate life. Give us your strength to live together with respect and commitment as we grow in your spirit, for you are God, now and forever. Amen. You can see words that represent images and concepts in this prayer that are so important to Indigenous people: creation, relationship, generosity, compassion, strength, respect, and commitment. All very important Indigenous core values, not just to my tribe, but across tribes. Relationship being the most important one. As I said before, we see all people, all of creation as related. The whole cosmos is tied together in a sacred relationship. Some of you may already be seeing things that way. That might be a part of your worldview. But if it's not, think of how it would change your world and your life if you did start seeing things that way. Seeing all that is in the cosmos as your relative and not something to be possessed or exploited. Now, I use the term indigenous. That's a universal term. In referring to Indigenous people, such as myself and others, the best way to do that is to refer to them by their tribal affiliation, if you know that. So for me, it would be Lakota or Oglala Sioux. For somebody else, it might be Anishinaabe Ojibwe. So that's the best way. If you don't know that, the term Indian is okay. It's okay to use the term Indian. We're not offended by that at all. And we refer to ourselves as such from time to time. Native American, not so much. American Indian, not so much, simply because it has the word America in it. And we are very sensitive about being referred to by people who have that word America involved in it, because America entails colonization. And we are colonized people. So we go by the United Nations definition of indigenous because it's very broad-based, universal. And my office is the Office of Indigenous Ministries because the Episcopal Church is international and not just based in the United States of America. So the UN definition is communities, peoples, and nations which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing on those territories or parts of them. So essentially, people who have lived in a certain area for an extended period of time, likely thousands of years, and have developed a relationship with the land, the geography, the animals of that region, so much that it becomes a part of their culture, their spirituality, and their identity. But they have been colonized by outside nations. So that's the key to the UN definition, is colonization. There are people all over the world who fit this definition, including in Europe. The Sami people of extreme North Scandinavia are Europe's indigenous people. I want to go back to before 1492. We all know what happened in 1492. There will be lots of celebrations throughout the nation regarding that tomorrow. There were indigenous people in this region all over the Western Hemisphere, specifically in the area now known as the United States. If you look at the map there, you see each one of the indigenous faces. I would say that each one of those faces represents at least a dozen, maybe 24 or more tribes. It's said that there wasn't an acre of land on what is now known as the United States before 1492 that was not the home of some indigenous tribe. There were people, there were villages all over, some of them of substantial population. We don't know how many indigenous people were living here at that time. Anthropologists estimate what it might have been based on the estimated population on other continents at that time. And that estimate has it range anywhere from a minimum of 10 million to maybe as many as 50 million indigenous people living in the region now known as the United States. We don't know for sure. But what we do know is that in 1890, the US indigenous population was recorded at 249,000. So even if you take the low figure of 10 million 1492. By 1890, by ordinary circumstances, that population should have at least doubled. It should have grown substantially during that 400-year period of time. The population in Europe tripled during that same time interval, and they had plagues in Europe at that time. But 249,000 by 1890. Statistically, that is what genocide looks like. And genocide took place here in the United States. We don't like to acknowledge that. We don't like to talk about it. We think of genocide as something that happens in other countries far away, initiated by evil dictators who are the bad guys. We don't like to admit that it happened right here in our own backyard. Much of it initiated by our own government, which is still in power and seen as the good guys. This genocide was intentionally and systematically implemented from 1492 to 1890. 1492, the Columbian Voyage, and 1890, the massacre at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. Now, when we think of genocide, my understanding of it is a way of making a people disappear. Making a people disappear. And there are several strategies or methods of making a people disappear. I'll talk about that in a moment. But that was initiated here, perpetuated by the European invaders in North America, and continued by the US government and churches, namely through a forced assimilation process called the residential schools or the boarding schools, a way of forcing a people to change and adapt to a different culture, language, religion, and worldview from what they had previously. The church was involved in this from the beginning. This is a picture of a papal bull, as I said before, an edict or decree from the Bishop of Rome. And in the 15th century and going into the 16th century, the Pope was involved in starting a process of colonizing other continents and enslaving or entirely annihilating the indigenous people who lived there. The Dum Diversas, which was written and issued in 1452, and the Romanus Pontifex in 1454, a couple of years later, were papal decrees or bulls issued by Pope Nicholas V to King Afonso V of Portugal, confirming to the Crown of Portugal dominion over the lands in Africa, along with encouraging the seizure of the lands of Saracen Turks and non-Christians. They granted permission for the enslavement of such peoples. So it started with the Dum Diversas and the Romanus Pontifex. Later, well, here's a quote from the Dum Diversas, 1452. "We," meaning the Pope, "grant you, the King of Portugal, by these present documents with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be." That was in essence the papal decree there. Search them out, seize them, reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. After the first Columbian voyage, when land and inhabitants were, quote unquote, found or discovered, Pope Alexander VI issued another decree called the Inter Cetera, in which he authorizes Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as discovered subjects. This was the first use of the term discovered or discovery. It also affirmed or reaffirmed the rights of Spain and Portugal to do the same in Africa. So in this document, the Inter Cetera lay the foundations for African slavery and genocide and land seizure in the Western Hemisphere. And it all came out of the church. That's where it started. Here is an artist's depiction of Columbus, quote unquote, discovering the Western Hemisphere. Now, what this eventually became to be recognized as by historians, these papal decrees, was a philosophy, a discovery philosophy. And it eventually became known as the Doctrine of Discovery. There is no one document or decree that's called the Doctrine of Discovery per se. Rather, it's a summarization of the philosophy expressed in these decrees that I just mentioned. And it spread. It spread throughout Europe. The leaders of European nations heard about this and they said, yes, we have the blessing and encouragement of the Pope to go forward and discover these lands. And as long as they're not already held or discovered by another Christian nation, these lands are ours and the people are ours. So eventually this philosophy made its way to England. King Henry VII, who granted a patent to John Cabot and his sons to essentially do the same in the name of the monarch of England, to investigate, claim, and possess lands which before this time were unknown to all Christians, which meant that he could not intrude on Spanish and Portuguese discoveries, but anything that wasn't, and that the king would receive some of the bounty that came as a result of that. This is commonly known as a right to domination, the right of a Christian nation to dominate so-called non-Christian lands and peoples. Here's an artist's depiction of Pocahontas. The Jamestown colony, the first long-standing permanent colony founded in 1607. Very flowery mythology around all of that. I think most of us are aware of it. In reality, she was a young indigenous woman. Birth name was Matoaka, the daughter of Powhatan, a chief of a local tribe. And as the story goes, she interceded on behalf of John Smith with her father so that John Smith was not executed for crimes committed against the people and the tribes there. And as a result, she was befriended by the English settlers and eventually married a man named John Rolfe. She was baptized into the Anglican expression of the Christian faith, changed her name to Rebecca Rolfe, and moved to England with her husband, where she died at age 22 and was buried. And she's still buried there. She's still there in England. It's presented, as I said, as a very flowery story, but it's totally fictitious. Almost all of it is fictitious. And rather than a beautiful love story that many of us are under the impression that it is and was, I can't think of a worse nightmare that would have happened for a young indigenous woman than to be taken from her home to a strange land where she died and didn't get a chance to come back home. That's the worst possible thing that could happen to an indigenous person, to be separated from their land and their people and never go back. It's worse than death. It's a fate worse than death, to be separated from your people. Because at least in death, you can go be with your people, with the ancestors who passed before you. But to be away from them in a strange new world, I grieve for her awful experience. But this story was created, it was manufactured in order to justify what was happening, the colonization process. It was a way for the colonizers to say, look, the indigenous people were on our side. They were in favor of what we were doing, and they wanted to help us achieve their objectives. The same type of fictitious story applies to Sacagawea, who assisted Lewis and Clark in finding their way across the United States to the Pacific Ocean. A lot of that is fictitious as well. Again, another story saying, look at this wonderful indigenous woman who helped the settlers out, helped them achieve their objectives. They must have wanted all of this to happen. And nothing could be further from the truth. So it spreads from England to the United States. Thomas Jefferson was a fan of the Doctrine of Discovery, and he wanted it applied to strategies in the United States, strategies and laws for expansion. You may recall that Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, referred to the merciless Indian savages in that document. That's how he refers to indigenous people, merciless Indian savages, who would be excluded from the principles of freedom and human rights that are declared in that document. We were specifically written out of the Declaration of Independence. In the 19th century, the Doctrine of Discovery was specifically used conceptually in the debate of public international law expounded by the U.S. Supreme Court in a series of decisions, most notably Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823. You may recall that from history, Johnson versus McIntosh. John Marshall was the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice at the time. He used King Henry VII's patent to John Cabot in justification of this court ruling. He said that the right of discovery, well illustrated by that royal commission, instructing the Cabots to seek out, discover, and find whatever isles, countries, and provinces of the heathens and infidels that before this time have been unknown to all Christian people. And the U.S. Supreme Court called this claim a right of domination. So what Johnson versus McIntosh essentially said was that indigenous people do not own their land. They have no rights to it. No rights to it. Unless the government grants them rights, they have no rights to it inherently. Interestingly, Marshall flip-flopped on this, and about 9 years later in the decision of Worcester versus Georgia, he said, no, indigenous people are tribal people, they are sovereign nations, and the U.S. must relate to them in that way. It was a victory for the indigenous people who instituted this court case, but it was short-lived as President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce it. The quote that's attributed to him was, "The Chief Justice has made his decision, now let him enforce it." He wouldn't carry it out. He decided to ignore it and move forward with expansion. And the tragedy of the Trail of Tears followed that. Southeastern tribes being forcibly deported, losing their homeland, sent to Oklahoma, marching there on foot, many of them dying along the way. The President of the United States functioned as a dictator during that time, totally ignoring the legal branch of government. And it's painful for indigenous people every time we take a $20 bill out of our wallets or purses to have to see the face of Andrew Jackson on it. Manifest Destiny became the United States understanding of the Doctrine of Discovery. It held that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. Manifest Destiny, and that's an artist's depiction of what that looked like. This is a painting by John Gast titled American Progress. And that is Lady Liberty, or Columbia, in the center. And she is moving from the east to the west, driving out the indigenous people and their bison, bringing, quote unquote, progress to this land. And many people saw that as a good thing. Well, indigenous people didn't. They saw it as the beginning of the end. So I mentioned that there were two methods to genocide. One is just total annihilation. We don't know how many indigenous people were killed, murdered over the centuries, just outright killed, or who died as a result of the introduction of pathogens and diseases that they had no immunity to, pestilence, famine, starvation. Millions, undoubtedly. This is Lakota artist Oscar Howe's depiction of Wounded Knee, the massacre in 1890, in which between 300 and 500 indigenous people, mostly women, children, and elders, were gunned down and buried in a mass grave. It's still there in South Dakota, Wounded Knee, the tombstone where the mass grave is. Their lives did not matter. Another way was through the residential schools or boarding schools. Many Indigenous people were sent to boarding schools across the United States, some of them taken from their families and sent there, not just for schooling, but for indoctrination into the American way of life. Here's a photo of the student body of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. That was the flagship residential school. It ran from 1879 to 1918. Over 10,000 Indigenous children attended that school. There's nothing left of it now. It's an Army War College, but there's nothing left of the school that was there except for the Indian cemetery containing the graves of 186 Indigenous children who died while they were at Carlisle. Under normal circumstances, when something like that happened, the Indigenous child was expected to be sent home for burial so that they could rest with their ancestors. These children were not. They were buried at Carlisle, and these are their graves. You can see the names of them and their tribal affiliations. I took these pictures when I visited there several years ago. Some of the gravestones are just marked unknown. And I think that's a very powerful image right there. Because what happens when a child, an Indigenous child, is forcibly assimilated into the dominant culture of American society, they lose their sense of identity, of who they are. And that stays with them for the rest of their lives. Here's a photo of the transition process of what we saw. Indigenous young men on the left before they entered Carlisle, and then on the right after they had been there. And this applies to virtually all boarding or residential schools, not just Carlisle. This is what happened. They went from being culturally congruent on the left to culturally assimilated into something else. They lost their identity, their sense of who they were. It was very traumatic, but it happened to tens of thousands of Indigenous children at that time, right here in this country. Both of my parents were raised in residential schools. My father was raised in the government boarding school, the U.S. government financed and run Indian boarding school in Pine Ridge, and my mother was raised in an Episcopal boarding school. Churches ran some of them too. She grew up in St. Mary's Episcopal School for Indian girls in Springfield, South Dakota. At the top here of this slide is St. Mary's School. That's the administration building of St. Mary's. It no longer exists. And at the bottom are two photos of my father. One when he was about 10 or 11 years old after he had been at the boarding school, and the other one to the right when he was an adolescent in high school, again at the boarding school. He was raised in that boarding school from age 5, is when he was taken there, age 5 to age 18. So for 13 years. He lived in that boarding school. He told me that after he was taken there at age 5, every evening after supper, he would go down to the gate, the front gate of the school. He said he would go down to the gate and wait for someone to come and take him home. And after about a year of doing that every day, he realized that the person he was waiting for wasn't coming. So he decided he needed to get tough, and he needed to get tough in order to survive. He would cry at night into his pillow so nobody would see or hear him. And he realized he was on his own, and he had to adapt to the new way of life. He had no choice if he was going to survive. So he grew up in that environment. Later, when he married my mother and raised a family, started having kids, it was tough for him to be a father because he didn't have a parent to raise him. He grew up in an institution. He didn't know what that was like to be a parent. So he did the best that he could, but he always squelched his emotions. He always held them back because he didn't think it was safe to share them. that stayed with him. And I experienced that myself from time to time as I learned it from him. So the question of who are we as Indigenous people today in the United States in the 21st century is a lingering question that all Indigenous people wrestle with. I know I will be struggling with it my entire life. The discovery of an authentic Indigenous identity within this current setting. It's difficult. It ain't easy. Well, today, our population is coming back. It's estimated to be over 6 million now. There are over 570 tribes in the United States, over 200 in Alaska alone. Currently, most of us do not live on reservations or land trusts, but in urban metropolitan areas. As far as the Church of England was concerned, the first contact with Indigenous people was by chaplains to Sir Francis Drake, who unintentionally met up with the Ohlone people in the San Francisco Bay Area now. The Ohlone people are still there. The first intentional colony was Jamestown, 1607, and the first intentional ministries to Indigenous people by the Episcopal Church were started by Bishop John Henry Hobart of New York, began a mission to the Oneida when they were there in the early 1800s. And then mission work in the upper Midwest started in the mid-1800s. And the Episcopal Church was very intentional about doing this. And even though we did participate in the assimilation process through our boarding schools, and we have to own up to that and take responsibility for it, we also did help Indigenous people to survive and raised up Indigenous leadership within the church. Now, you might ask the question, why would Indigenous people be interested in joining a Christian church in the 19th century? You'd think that we wouldn't be. Well, there were 3 reasons. First one, our traditional Indigenous ceremonies were made illegal. It was against the law for us to practice them publicly. Indigenous people are very spiritual. We are. That's one of the things that really distinguishes us. We are spiritual. We don't have a dichotomy of sacred and secular. Everything to us is sacred. Everything to us is spiritual. So we must practice our spirituality in some way. So the only legal way for us to do that was through the Christian churches. The second reason was out of necessity to survive. As I said, the churches, especially the Episcopal Church, helped Indigenous people, kept us from starvation, interceded in our behalf with the federal government. An Indigenous person was in a very precarious situation if he or she did not have a church affiliation in the 19th century. So part of it was out of necessity to survive. The other one was that we identified with the Christ figure as expressed in the Gospels and the New Testament. We didn't know about the first century Palestinian Jew known as Jesus of Nazareth, but we knew the Christ. We had Christ-like figures in our traditional stories and spiritual expressions, figures that embodied the same values that Christ does, that Jesus Christ does. So when we heard the gospel, we instantly picked up on it and said, oh yes, we understand this. We know what it's about. Because the gospel is truth, and the gospel is universal. So we were able to see that. Bishop Stephen Charleston does a wonderful job of explaining this in his book, The 4 Vision Quests of Jesus. If you haven't read that book, I encourage you to do so. The 4 Vision Quests of Jesus. It explains how a person can be authentically Christian and authentically native at the same time because of our recognition of Christ and the native Messiah. So missionary work occurred substantially in the upper Midwest with Indigenous people by missionaries of the Episcopal Church and the bishops, and that included ordaining Indigenous people to the orders of ministry. This is a photo of Enumagabo, the first Indigenous Episcopal priest, who was ordained in 1867, 57 years before Native Americans were made United States citizens. So he wasn't even a citizen of the United States when the Episcopal Church ordained him to ministry. And he was a member of a tribe, I believe, that technically was at war with the United States. And the Episcopal Church ordained him to the priesthood anyway. And to me, that's pretty cutting edge stuff. And it indicates how far the church is willing to go to raise up Indigenous leadership. And this is Harold Stephen Jones, Santisu, the first Indigenous bishop in the Episcopal Church. I knew him when I was confirmed in the church. He gave me this cross called the Niobrara Cross, a cross for Indigenous people when they become confirmed into the faith. Harold Jones, the first Episcopal Native American bishop. And this is a recent photo of the presiding bishop's visit to Navajo land. Happened in 2018. And you can see in front a number of Navajo clergy in that region, including Catherine Plummer and Kathleen Plummer in the front. We're very proud to have Indigenous people continue to be raised up in the church. And that's a big part of what my ministry is about. Where does Indigenous ministry occur in the church? Well, most of it occurs in what are called the four principal dioceses: North and South Dakota, Navajo land, which is a pie chart, looks like a pie chart over in the southwestern part of the country, and Alaska. So North and South Dakota, Navajo land, and Alaska. They receive substantial funding in the form of block grants from General Convention every triennium. But in reality, as I said, Indigenous people live all over the country. I don't think there's a diocese in the Episcopal Church where Indigenous people are not living. Now, they may not be seen or recognized, but they're there. My office was created in 1954, the Office of Indigenous Ministries, and the first missioner, my predecessor, was the Reverend Vine Deloria Sr. He's the father of the famous author, Vine Deloria Jr. Now, this is important to know. The Episcopal Church repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery in 2009, repudiated it. And many denominations have done so since then. And so part of our mission since then has been to do work in responding to what happened, and working for justice and reconciliation and trying to right the wrongs of the past. And part of it involves the 2018 General Convention resolution to require that the Doctrine of Discovery be taught to everyone who's in the ordination process in the Episcopal Church, so that they will know about it, teach it to their congregations. So with the end goal of all Episcopalians knowing about what happened and what the church's response to it should be. The Episcopal Church had a very strong and supportive presence in North Dakota on the Standing Rock Reservation in response to the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was going through perilously near the reservation and will undoubtedly have a negative impact on the water and the land and the people in that region. The Episcopal Church went there to demonstrate as water protectors on behalf of the tribe. Here's the presiding bishop there on Standing Rock. And many of us participated as water protectors in the demonstrations against those who were there to enforce the pipeline going through, and some were tear gassed in the process. Well, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but what I'd like to conclude with is, some people ask me, well, what can we do? You know, knowing this history now, knowing what happened, how can we respond? And sometimes the response can be kind of hostile. There was one person who said to me, well, what do you expect from us? We're not going to give you the land back. And unless there are certain instances where there are treaty violations, Indigenous people don't even have that. We don't have that on our radar screen, giving the land back, because we don't want anybody to lose their home. We don't want to put out anyone. We don't want anyone to lose their home. We know what that's like to have experienced that. We don't wish that on anybody. But what can be done is a land acknowledgement. Many churches and dioceses are already doing this. And what it is it's just a way of acknowledging who the Indigenous people were who lived on the territory where you now are. where your church is, where your diocese is, where your property, where your home, where your house is. Finding out who those people were who lost their homes so you could have yours. And acknowledging them, just acknowledging that that happened. Saying their names, honoring them, and then praying that justice and reconciliation can happen and that we might be instruments of it. So here's an example of a land acknowledgement. And something like this could be done during a church service, during announcements at the beginning of a service. It could be put in the bulletin, it could be put in a newsletter, it could be put on a website. Just saying, yes, there were people here before we arrived. And we'd like to acknowledge that and honor them, give thanks for them, and work so that this doesn't happen again. And do what we can to help them. This isn't too difficult to do. This is not difficult to do. But it's one thing that can help. Because the thing that we don't want to do is not acknowledge this, that it happened, to not tell the stories. Because if we don't acknowledge and we don't tell the stories, people are going to forget about it. And eventually people are even going to deny that any of this even happened. That's a real possibility. The stories need to be told. So that's all I have right now. And I'm available for any questions that anybody might have. Here's some, well, when I present in person, these are some of the questions I ask for the people, but I don't know if there's anything that's been submitted yet or not, but if there is, I'm willing to address it in what time we have left.
Thank you so much, Brad, for the incredibly powerful presentation. We do have a few questions already. One person asks about the differences between Canada and the US when it comes to Indigenous issues. Specifically, the person mentions that Canadian prime ministers did a much more public apology for the residential school program than was done in the US. And this person's wondering if you had any comments on the differences in the way Canada and the US have handled these issues.
Thank you. Very similar genocidal and assimilation processes happened in Canada as well to the First Nations people there. And some of the tribes actually crossed the boundaries. The tribes were there before the boundary between Canada and the United States was formed. So there's a great deal of similarity that's there. However, I agree, Canada has done a much more thorough and penitential job of apologizing for what happened and working for justice and reconciliation. We really haven't done much of that in the United States. We really haven't. We've repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery. I think President Obama issued a statement during his presidency acknowledging what happened. That got very little press coverage, as far as I can remember, very little press coverage. It basically wasn't even noticed. And we continue to face the struggle today. I can't tell anybody how to vote, and I'm not doing that. But I do know that the current president supports the Columbus discovery and manifest destiny narratives of America and is against changing Columbus Day to anything else. So we're back in the struggle. It feels like we've taken steps backwards in this. Canada, I would say, is far ahead of us. And I wish that we could be to the point where they are.
Another person asks about Two-Spirit peoples, and if you can talk about kind of the intersection of the LGBTQ plus community and Indigenous people.
Indigenous people, and I say this across tribes, have never been gender binary. We have always recognized multiple genders, and some tribes, I think the number goes even as high as 6 genders that are recognized and honored, affirmed, and honored and respected in the communities. We've never been prejudiced at all against people who are what we refer to as two-spirited. And the typical understanding of that is a cis male who has the spirit of a female, or a cis female who has the spirit of a male. That's picked up on pretty early in life, and the person is recognized and honored as being two-spirited. This is one of the many gifts, I think, that Indigenous culture can give the church. The Episcopal Church is our recognition of this, our affirmation of it. Other examples of that would be as I said, our worldview of all things being related, our way of honoring and caring for the earth as our mother, caring for creation, and our affirmation of female authority and leadership in our cultures and societies. We've always had these things, and they're very precious gifts that we offer to the church, and will continue to do so.
Final question before we have to stop. One person is wondering if you can speak to the Black Lives Matter movement, especially in the past year after the death of George Floyd, and also the increasing use of the acronym BIPOC to stand for Black, Indigenous, People of Color.
We stand with Black Lives Matter. And we also say Indigenous Lives Matter, because they haven't to the present day. I mean, history says that, present day events say that. So we stand together demanding that society and those in authority demonstrate that our lives matter as much as anybody else's do. There's never been a time in American history when all lives have mattered. There's never been a time in the past to the present. Now, Indigenous people and African American people share a common heritage, and that goes all the way back to the Doctrine of Discovery, those papal decrees, which first affected Africa and the Indigenous people there, and then were later extended to the United States. So we share that common scourge of history, and we have suffered together ever since. We also were in many ways allies of each other in the early history of this country, particularly during slavery. Some of our tribes helped escaped slaves through the Underground Railroad process. Many of us intermarried and had children together. There are a number of African Americans who know that they have Indigenous ancestry in there somewhere. And I believe it. It's obvious that is the case. So unfortunately, many times it was suppressed on the part of both people for reasons of protection, because if they came out and acknowledged it, there would be trouble. I also know that in Virginia, for example, we were all lumped together. There was a time in Virginia, I don't know if it's still, I don't think it still is the case, but I know throughout history in Virginia, two kinds of people were recognized: white people and colored. And Indigenous people were included among the colored. So we have a very common history and present experience by which and through which we stand together to the present day.
Brad, unfortunately, we do need to stop now, but I am incredibly grateful for your generosity of time and being with us and sharing this painful legacy with us, but also the important work that you're doing. And thank you on behalf of St. Bart's and the church for all that you're doing.
And I thank you too, as the Lakota say, wopila, wopila. Thank you.
All right, and thank you all for watching. Please join us for worship at 11 a.m.